crisp, sharp images. That's what we want. Here's how to make it happen. Welcome back. So as a sports photographer, you're always looking to get that really nice, crisp, tack sharp photo to make your subject really pop and stand out on the frame. And I know a lot of you have been requesting a video on this topic about focus and getting the right settings. So without further ado, here it is. I'm going to try and break this down as simply as I possibly can for you. This can be kind of a tricky subject to talk about, but I'm going to break this down in simple terms. So really there are two variables that you need to set in order to nail your focus every time. The first one is your focus mode, and the second is your AF area mode. Each of these variables has 3 or 4 different options within them. So let's break these down one by one. And first, let's start with an overview of the basic focus modes. On a high level up here, there are 3 main focus modes that you can choose from. And keep in mind, every different camera company has a different name for these focus modes, but just important to know that from company to company, they all do pretty much the same thing, just with a different name. And those 3 are single focus, continuous focus, and manual focus. So let's start with single. Single means once you have your focus locked in, your focus point isn't going to move or change. So let's say you're shooting, you lock in onto your subject with the focus button, and then you either move around with your camera or you recompose your shot. That original focus point that you selected is going to stay. It's not going to change no matter how you move or how you recompose the shot. So single point mode is best for static subjects that aren't moving around. So whenever I'm shooting a portrait where I have time to compose the subject and the subject isn't moving, or details like balls, bats, equipment, where I know my focus point isn't going to have to move or jump around, that is when I'm using single mode or AFS mode. Now, an easy way to remember this, just think of the letter S. S stands for single and also for static. And on the other hand, you've got AFC mode, which stands for continuous. And basically this works exactly the opposite as does the AFS mode that we were just talking about. So if you've got your focus button held down, your focus is going to continuously move and track with your subject no matter where it goes in your frame. So any situation where you're trying to track a moving subject, like your kids running around or a sprinter running down a track or a pitcher going through his windup, or any fast-paced action sequence, that's where you want to use the continuous mode. So to kind of talk about the contrast between the two, usually during pregame, if I'm shooting portraits of our athletes or pregame ceremonies or just features of our athletes getting ready, that is when I am in AFS mode. But as soon as the game starts and as soon as the actual game action, the live action on the field happens, that is when I switch over to AFC mode. So to remember this in an easy sort of way, just remember the letter C stands for continuous and also competition. These days, manual focus doesn't come into play as much, but this is where you have to really respect the shooters who were doing it before digital existed. They didn't have the luxury of AFS mode, AFC mode. They were shooting real-time sports action all on manual. So that's where you gotta respect it. But there are a few situations where manual does work still. This is basically the mode that lets you override all of your camera's autofocus settings and allows you to manually focus your shot. You're probably wondering, why would I ever use manual mode when I've got all this amazing autofocus technology at my disposal? But typically I use manual when I'm setting up a remote or a time lapse where I don't want the autofocus to jump around or latch on to something unexpected, or when I'm shooting in a really, really low light situation and the camera's just really struggling to pick up the autofocus because the environment that you're shooting in is just so dark. There are still a few instances where you would use manual mode in sports photography, but just keep in mind, these days we've got it pretty easy as sports photographers with all this incredible autofocus technology that is available to us. Once you've got your autofocus nailed down, then you want to move into dialing in your autofocus area preference, what we call AF area. And this is basically the variable that tells your camera which exact focus point or pinpoint that you want it to pick up to make sure that you can lock in on your subject. Now, keep in mind, again, every camera company makes their own different modes for this. For the purposes of this video, I'm gonna go over 3 basic modes that cover most models out there and most different camera makes out there. But just keep in mind, your individual camera may have different ones. They may be called something different. They vary model to model. With DSLR and with mirrorless cameras, they are built with dozens of individual focus points all around the frame, and those are there to allow you maximum control and maximum precision to dial in exactly which part of your frame or which part of your subject you want to be in focus. So the single point AF area mode is exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to pick one of these dozens of individual points to lock onto, depending on where your subject is and how they move around the frame. Folks, for me, I use single point about 95% of the time for sports action. But do keep in mind, this is probably best for more advanced shooters, as there's a lot more margin for error in this mode. So I think of this as the high risk, high reward option. If you nail that focus, it will be as sharp as you can possibly get for an image, but if you miss, you're going to miss bad. AFS mode is basically that one single tiny little point of focus within your entire viewfinder or your entire frame that you're looking through. Although it does allow for the greatest amount of precision, it is also the most difficult to use. So if you are a beginner, I suggest you kind of work your way up to this mode rather than diving right in. Speaking of getting started, if you are just kind of starting out with sports photography, the group AF area mode might be the best option for you. Basically how this works is it expands upon that single point focus idea, but expands that point into a cluster of focus points to give you a larger target area to hit while you're trying to lock onto your subject. So instead of that single tiny focus point, now you've got 3 to 5 different points all clustered together in like a ball to lock onto your subjects. So when I started shooting sports, this is what I use to practice because it gives you a larger target to work with to try and lock onto your subject. And when your subject's moving fast, I know this can be difficult to do. So the bigger group of focus points, the higher probability you have to get your subject in focus. This is a great option as you're starting out, as you learn to track subjects while they're moving. Finally, you've got dynamic mode, or some camera companies now are calling it auto or auto plus mode. Basically how this works is it tracks onto your subject, and then as your subject moves to other individual focus points within your viewfinder, it will continue to track your subject as it spreads around the frame. So it's basically your camera assuming that you want to keep the subject in that same spot, but it also adjusts the focus points as needed to help you out as the subject moves across your frame. Now, this may sound like the ideal scenario, basically let the camera do all the work, but personally, and this is just a personal preference, I don't fully trust it. I know this technology is amazing with the cameras coming out right now, but honestly, for my personal preference, sometimes it almost feels like it's too good. Like sometimes it'll track on and lock onto subjects that I don't want to be in focus when I'm composing my shot. So personally, I like to have as much full control over my focus as I possibly can, but it is good to know that this option does exist. I know that's a lot, it can be kind of confusing, so let's just review at a high level. First, there are 3 basic focus modes to choose from: single, continuous, or manual. Pick the right one based on what situation you're in as far as your subject and how quickly your subject is moving. Then you've got 3 or 4 different AF area modes. Pick the right one based on your confidence and your skill level as a shooter tracking fast moving subjects. My personal setup is I use AFS during portraits, features, or pre-games, anything that's not really moving too fast. Then I switch over to AFC during the actual game action. When I was learning how to shoot sports, I started out by using the group and the dynamic modes to help me actually get shots in focus. But now as a more advanced shooter, I use single point AF area 95% of the time to give me that full control. So that's it for this one. I know focus can be a little bit of a blurry subject when it comes to sports photography, but hopefully this video cleared some things up for you. But you know the drill. If you have any questions at all, drop them down in the comment section below. Give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And remember, sports photography takes practice. It takes a lot of practice to get your shots in focus. So get out there and practice. And also remember, don't let the pandemic be an excuse to keep you from shooting. Get out there.